Hi and welcome to Swedish Plantguys. We get a lot of questions on this channel that inspire us so much. Now, everything in this video is based on our over 40 years experience of taking care of plants. And including our cameraman, it's based on our 40 years experience of taking care of plants. Let's go.
Okay, so the question we're going to try to answer today is, can I put a plant that needs a small amount of water in a self-watering pot?
So the quick answer here is yes.
Could you give an example, please?
Yes, but what we think they mean by little water here is that a plant that wants the soil to dry up a lot in between watering, so that they never stand in water and the soil is not moist for a very long period of time, which, since in a self-watering system you have a lot of water, so that could be a problem. Now, we have two different types of plants here that are considered to be little water plants, and one of them is of course the CC plant here. Now this is the variety NC, so it's a special kind of CC plant, but this wants to be bone dry before you water it again. So can we put this in a self-watering pot that has a lot of water in it? And we have the Sansevieria variety, or which now is called a Dracaena. Now this is the Sansevieria or Dracaena Zeylanica. I think they call this the compacta, but I'm not quite sure. But this is also a plant that wants to really dry out in between waterings. So can we put these plants into a self-watering system?
So the fear probably is that if you put it in a self-watering system and you fill that up with a lot of water, it will hurt the plants.
So I think we have to break this down even more, because a lot of people might not know what a self-watering pot or a self-watering system is. Now, this here is a store-bought self-watering system or pot. And it is built with a lot of components. Now we have an outer pot here, and this outer pot is actually meant to keep the water. So this is basically a water reservoir or a water container that's going to hold the water. Then we have an inner pot here that is raised from the bottom. So it doesn't have any contact with the water in the bottom of the outer pot here. We also have these nylon ropes here that are going down to the water. So these ropes are basically going to push water from the reservoir in the bottom up to the soil and to the roots of the plant. And then usually in this type of system here, we have a water level indicator, just so that we know how much water is inside of the outer pot. We don't have to take the inner pot out. We know with this gauge here. So that is usually how a self-watering system is built. Now, if you want to create your own self-watering system, we have a video you can go and watch where we basically just show you how easy it is to do this by yourself.
Self-watering pot is actually a bad name for it. I think a lot of people think when they see a self-watering pot is that they just have to fill it up with water and then it does some kind of magic and waters the plant itself. That's not how it works.
It doesn't grow legs and walk to the sink and give it some water.
What it really is, it is it's not a self-watering pot. It's more like a watering storage system. Yeah. So it gives you the option to fill with more water than the plant needs for that moment.
You don't have to water as often. You have to water maybe once a month. That is usually the basics of a self-watering system, and you don't have to water it every day or every week. You can water less frequently.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that brings us to the next topic. How are you supposed to water your plants in a self-watering pot?
Yeah, well, you can actually do two different things in a self-watering system. One is that you could put and water this system on top of the soil here. Because what will happen is that the water will go through the soil, some of that water will be absorbed by the soil, and then you have small drainage holes in the bottom here. So the excess water will go down into the outer pot here, to the storage units down here. That is the first... Hold on, I'll just fix this. So, there. Now, the second way of watering a self-watering pot is, of course, that you could water. In this case, it's a store-bought pot. So I could take out this water level indicator here and water in the hole here. Now, what happens is that the water goes straight down, because it doesn't reach the soil here, it goes straight down to the water reservoir. So it never ever touches the soil. If we do it like that, then all of the water here, or much of the water, is going to be pushed up through the nylon ropes to the soil. So we can water this in two different ways. Now, we prefer, or we almost always use the first method, by watering on top of the soil and letting the excess water go down into the water reservoir. Now, the reason for this is that then we know that all of the roots inside of the soil here actually get to be a little bit moist. They get water. We know that every part of this system gets water. Oh, if you use the second method and water in the hole here, or just water straight down into the reservoir, you actually don't know how much of that water is going to be soaked up by the soil here. So all of the roots might not get that water. That is the reason why we usually water on top of this and not straight down into the reservoir.
Yeah, and especially if it's a new plant that's newly planted, because it doesn't have the root system.
Yeah.
For an older plant that you've had for years in a self-watering pot, you could probably water in the container right away, because it's going to have probably even roots going down through the drainage holes and into the container. So it will get the water.
We'll actually show that a little bit later on, how that looks. But to the problem here, because we have a lot of water here down all the time, we have that nylon rope that is continuously pushing water through capillary force up to the soil. So can we put a plant in this system that doesn't want to stand in water and it wants to dry out in between waterings? Now, we said the quick answer was yes, but you have to consider in a self-watering pot what type of a plant you have. So make sure to ask where you've bought the plant, or just try and do your research on the plant you've bought to see if it is a plant that wants to dry up a little bit in between waterings, or if it wants to stay moist at all times. Now, when you know that, you also know how to water your plant.
A little question. So basically, if it is a plant that needs to or wants to dry out in between waterings, I just stop it and let the whole container dry out?
Exactly. That is exactly what we're saying. If you have a plant that wants to be moist at all times, you can make sure that you have water down in the reservoir at all times, because then you know that it will be pushing water up to the soil and keep that soil moist. But if it is a plant that wants to dry out, you actually do the exact same thing as if you didn't have this system. You let that water reservoir dry out, and you let the soil of the plant dry out before you add new water. Now I know that a lot of people are quite afraid of doing this because they think that, well, if you have it in this system, the plant actually gets used to having that access to water at all times. But it doesn't really work like that because it still wants to dry out.
So, what should we consider with the soil or the substrate you're using in a self-watering system?
Yeah.
What's most important to think about?
That's a very good question because in a self-watering pot, it's exactly the same as if you had a normal pot, a normal planted pot. You need good drainage. And it's especially important if you have a plant that wants to dry out, because if you don't have good drainage in the soil or substrate here that it's planted in, then that soil will absorb a lot of water because it has access to water, a lot of water, and it will absorb that and it will hold on to that water for a very long period of time. So that could potentially harm the roots. It could actually even kill the plant. So when we are planting in a self-watering pot, we need to have good drainage. Now, how do we get good drainage, or what is good drainage? Well, you need to have a soil that can absorb some water, but it will not hold that water. The excess water will go down into the bottom of the pot. Now, we usually recommend on this channel that you can use a standard normal planting soil and you can mix that up with something to get better drainage. Now, usually we use perlite, leca pebbles, or pumice to mix up that standard planting soil. Now, a good mix is somewhere around 70% of standard planting soil and 30% of perlite, pumice, or leca. If you do that mixture, you get a good drainage in this soil.
So maybe you can show us on some plants that you've brought.
Yeah.
It's much easier.
I have two plants with me here today that are actually from my own home. And I water these two plants at the same time, always. Around once a month. And I water them at the same time. However, I do not give them the same amount of water. And we'll show you that. Now, the first plant is a Ficus plant. This is a Ficus microcarpa ginseng. I think it has a ton of different names in different parts of the world. But basically, it is a ficus plant that has been put on another type of plant here to get a bonsai-looking shape. Now, this is a plant that drinks a lot of water, and it is a plant that actually wants to be a little bit moist at all times. It can dry up, the soil can dry up, it doesn't harm the plant, but it likes to be a little bit moist at all times. So this is a perfect plant to keep in a self-watering system because you don't have to water as often and as much. Because this, if I hadn't had this in a self-watering system, I probably would have had to water this every day or every other day. Now I water it around once a month.
Yeah, and that's the biggest pro you get from a self-watering pot.
Yeah, you don't have to water it
as often.
Yeah. But then on the other hand, I have another plant in my home and it's standing in the same room as this one. Now, this is a Clusia rosea. I think this one is called Green Magic, but that is also a name that I'm not quite sure of. But the Clusia variety is a form of plant that actually wants the soil to dry up in between waterings. That will promote growth and it will be healthier, because if the soil is moist at all times, you can get problems with the roots. So it wants to dry out, basically. Now I have these two in the same room. This is standing and gets a lot of direct sunlight. And this is standing in another window that gets a lot of indirect sunlight but no direct sunlight. So they're not standing close together, but they are in the same room. And I water these plants at the same time. Now what I do is a little bit different, because I know here that we have a plant that wants a lot of water, we have a plant that doesn't want a lot of water, but I water them at the same time. Now what I do is that I water my ficus plant here, and I make sure that the indicator here, water level indicator, goes up to max. I know that it has all of the water it can and all of the water it wants here. Then I go to water this plant. Now what I do here is that I water on top of the soil, as we usually do here, on top of the pomace in this case, and I just water and wait until I hear that the water is starting to go through the drainage holes here. They start to drip down into the water reservoir. Then I stop. So this is getting, I don't know how much, maybe 2 liters or around 2 liters of water. And this is only getting maybe half a liter of water. And then I wait.
How often do you do this?
Yeah, I do it, I say around once a month, because I keep an eye on this one here. Because as soon as I see that the water level indicator is going down to the bottom here, I know that this water reservoir is empty. Then I go and water again. I water this to the top, and I just give this one until I hear that it drips through here. So this almost never has a lot of water in the bottom here. This only has that little bit of water that goes through the pot. The excess water is down here. This almost always have a lot of water down here.
So if that one doesn't want to have a lot of water, why do you have it in a self-watering system?
Yeah, good. Basically because I don't want to water as often. I don't want to water, I don't have the time to water often. So this actually gets to be the perfect drainage system for a plant that doesn't want to stand in water and doesn't want to have a lot of water. Because when I water this, the excess water goes through this system. If I had this in a normal pot, I would have to make sure that all the excess water, that I took that out. I took it away, because it never wants to stand in water. That will harm the roots. I don't have to worry about that. I water it, I make sure that the excess water goes down here, and then I know that there are a little bit of water, and some of that water will continuously go up to the soil. But I also know that since I'm not going to be watering this for a couple of weeks, it will dry out. It will start to dry out. And the plant loves that. So by having these in self-watering systems, even though this really doesn't need to be in one, I'm helping myself not to water as often, and I'm also helping the plant to make sure that it never ever stands in water, because that is the killer. If we have the CC plant here, for instance, if this plant stands in water, it will die. It will get root rot, and it will show you immediately by becoming black on the stems here, and it will just collapse.
So it's actually a big advantage to have a plant that doesn't need that as much water in a self-watering system. It's much easier to remember to water your plants if you water all of your plants at the same time. If you're anything like me, it's easy to forget, did I water it last week or didn't I? Yeah. But if I water all my plants at the same time, even though this doesn't need as much water, it's much easier to remember.
It gets simpler. It's the easy answer.
Makes your life much easier.
Yeah. We've gotten a lot of questions also concerning, because in a system like this, what happens over time is that the plant starts to send roots down the holes of this inner pot into the water storage down here. And those roots actually become water roots. Now I can show you here, because it's really, really clear on the ficus here. If we take this out, it looks like this. You have a lot of roots coming out from the bottom of the holes here, and these roots here are basically water roots. They're not regular soil roots, if you want to call them that. And if we have water roots in the system, if I let this dry out, aren't these harmed? I know we get a lot of questions on that as well. And the answer is no. They will actually survive that. It doesn't matter if it dries up for a little while. They will just start to drink water again when you eventually fill it up with water. Now, on the Clusia here, since the Clusia is not getting a lot of water all the time, it's actually drying up in between waterings, it doesn't send out as many roots down to the bottom here because there's no water. So the concentration of roots in this plant here is actually here, within the soil, within the pomace in this case. So we can actually see through this pot, and there is a lot of roots here, but almost no roots coming down into the water reservoir. On contrary, we have the ficus plant that always have the availability of water in the reservoir, so it sends out a lot of roots to that water. But don't be alarmed if this should dry up. It's not a problem. It will not kill your plants if it's not for a very long period of time. It can survive like that for a couple of days, even a week. As soon as you start adding water again, those roots will start up again and drink water.
It's usually worse for the plant if you water it too much. If you accidentally water a plant like this Clusia, give this too much water. You can always let almost all plants dry out for a short period of time, even a plant that wants a lot of water. But if you give a plant that doesn't want a lot of water, too much water, you will drown the roots. So if you're a bit unsure, you can always try to let them dry out a little bit more. It's better to let it dry out than to give too much water.
What's the recommendation when we are using fertilizer in this kind of system? What do you recommend?
So you can water with fertilizer both on top of the soil or the pumice, as in this case, or directly into the storage. You should use a fertilizer that you mix in the water can, and then you water from that. So don't use fertilizer like sticks or things like that you put into the soil. That doesn't work as good when you use a self-watering system.
However, we always water with fertilizer on top of the soil in a system like this. Now, as he said, you can do both, but we always use that method. Now, the reason for that is that when you add that fertilized water here, the soil or pumice or whatever you have for substrate here actually absorbs a lot of that nutrient and holds on to it. That is something called CEC, or cation exchange capacity. It holds on to the nutrients and then distributes it to the roots of the plant. So if you water on top of the soil, we recommend to use the standard normal recommendation on the fertilizer you use. So you mix it up exactly as they say you should. However, if you want to fertilize straight down into the water reservoir, our recommendation is that you dilute that concentration of nutrients. So maybe use half the recommended dosage of fertilizer to water. Because what could happen down here by these water roots is that the concentration can be too high, and it could damage the roots instead of help the roots.
So the question we had was, can I put a plant that needs a small amount of water in a self-watering system? And the quick answer was yes.
But not even that. We've actually said here that it might even be better for your plants to have them in this type of system, because not only does it help the plant to not stand in water, but you don't have to water as often. So it's actually better for the plant to have it in this type of system.
Yeah.
Now, if you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. That really helps our channel a lot. If you haven't subscribed already, please do, and hit the bell as well so you get a notification every time we put up something new. Follow us on Facebook and Instagram, where you can get sneak previews on upcoming videos and sometimes a little bit more. Now until next time, hej då!